Welcome to Conscious Quest, the LA-based podcast where we aim to stay conscious about everything current. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of Conscious Quest. I'm one of your hosts, Sarah Parlow.
My name is Rishi Khatri.
And we have a very special topic today. We are going to discuss one of Rishi's favorites.
Yeah, we're talking about Joseph Campbell today.
And Joseph was quite culturally impactful. He was an American author and professor of literature at St. Lawrence College in Yonkers, New York. And he focused on comparative religion and especially mythology. And he wrote a really seminal work in 1949. Rishi knows about it.
Yeah, it's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
And what does it talk about in there?
The hero's journey.
And the hero's journey is what Joseph coined a monomyth. This was his word for it. And essentially, we have these stories that we tell, and they ring true in cultures all around the world. And the hero's journey is one of them, which it just keeps repeating itself as if it's some sort of global archetype. And there's different parts to the hero's journey, isn't there, Rishi?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I can talk about them, or do you want to start discussing?
Well, there's 3 parts. We'll start with that. And essentially, when a hero is called, there's like this sort of inner tug in order to grow and change. Like the status quo is not acceptable anymore. And so when the calling comes, and if the hero chooses to heed that calling, they generally go on a 3-act extravaganza. It starts with the departure, where the hero must leave his ordinary existence, the ordinary world, such as the Hobbit in Lord of the Rings. And then there is this initiation, this sort of trial by fire. They have to endure certain tasks and ordeals in this sort of unknown world. And then there is the return, where that person has gained something in the unknown world and must bring it back with them to the ordinary world as a boon and as a gift to other people, or maybe just him or herself.
That's right.
Yeah.
So all of us, go through, in many ways, our own journey, we're all the heroes in our own story.
Yeah.
And what Joseph Campbell talked about during, when he made The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the way he got to it was that he examined myths from all around the world. And what he found is there's elements, exactly what you just described, in terms of the call to adventure, in terms of crossing the threshold, the trials and tribulations, the return, etc. They're all similar elements,
Yeah.
And what Joseph surmised from that is that there's probably a similar archetype that runs through all of humanity. All of us have like a similar type of way of thinking, and when he talked about that back in the 60s, and obviously it launched him into fame, and then George Lucas actually used that for his family story. I can't remember what it's called.
Oh, that Star Wars thing.
Star Trek. I don't remember.
So that's an example of a modern myth, right?
That's
Rishi?
right.
Yeah.
Because part of what we do is that when our myths, we have like a certain topic we want to talk about, but like in terms of like what our myths are important for us because they give us information about our morals, about how we should behave in many ways, what we should, how to surpass our own selves. And if you look at myths, they're usually about gods and heroes and like these people who we aspire to be.
Yeah.
So then we can kind of follow those footsteps of those great people. And that's what myths give us. And in many ways too, the myths they have a lot of analogies, a lot of symbolism, and then part of when you look at the symbolism of the ancient world, in the biblical times and all these things, and those stories from the Odyssey and Gilgamesh, those were applicable for those times.
Yes.
Those are the symbolism. Those are the metaphors that people could understand back then.
Right.
But Joseph Campbell always described how the myths need to be updated so that people can look at that, from and be able to relate to those myths. Otherwise, they become irrelevant.
Yeah.
and they
And
fall away.
right. And I think what is universal though is that all of this speaks to the parts of life that we cannot explain any other way. These sort of unconscious drives and the processes that we go through, because the hero's journey can either be internal or external. It doesn't just have to be like a journey off into the mountains, or whatever. But, I think story and myth is a way that humans can make sense of the intangible things, and that is the part that is universal. But I think there are a lot of myths in today's world that need to be updated.
A lot of it. Well, that's kind of why we have these new stories.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why Star Wars and The Hobbit, along with Lord of the Rings, all those ones, they hit for some reason. What he described, if you look at those particular stories, they all have this entity, this person, who's this naive child almost, and a youth, a callow youth, and then he crosses the threshold. And so if you look at Star Wars, it's Luke. He has to heed the call to adventure, along with Bilbo, right? So there's two calls to adventure. There's the first where what is that guy's name? Who I can't remember all my Star Wars stuff, but then eventually
Han Solo.
it was Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Oh, right. He was the guide, and in a lot of heroes' journeys, there are guides along the way.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. And so once you heed the call to adventure, then you go to the threshold, and all of a sudden your whole world changes. And then that is a similar thing that we go through as well. We have points in our own life where we either have to take the call to adventure, and tend to encounter, and go past the threshold. The threshold is something that is our familiar world. And it's much easier to stay in our familiar world, to kind of keep on in your same, things that you're used to, the same people or the same
status
location.
Quo. Yeah.
Exactly, the status quo. Why rock it, Because to go past your threshold, it's uncomfortable.
It's scary.
It's scary.
It's the unknown.
It's stressful.
Yeah.
And then, but we all, in order for us to grow, we have to keep on expanding. We have to go past that threshold, past our comfort limit. And that's kind of what Joseph Campbell was describing, and what these stories all describe.
And you brought up a really interesting thing, the idea of suffering as a benefit, as a good thing. And it is essential for us to grow as people. But the human mind is a funny thing. It thrives off prediction. And when we try to step outside of something it can predict, we jump into this sort of fight or flight circumstance a lot. And what we're really talking about when we're discussing the hero's journey is a transformation of what, though, Rishi?
Well, gosh, it's a transformation of our subconscious, perhaps. It's a transformation of our own self, of the self, the ultimate self that we all are. And to become away from our childish, naive type of persona and person that we were, and become greater than we were before.
So the hero returns from his or her journey, the same person, but better, like more deep, more drawn from like the well of their own experience, and more capable, and bringing like specific special gifts that they didn't have before. And it is a sort of form of spiritual alchemy in a way. And it's just so beautiful that historically cultures all around the world have used these sort of principles to describe the whole process. And there's rites of passage and initiation in all cultures, whether it be going from child to adult, or single person to married person. And so all of these are these very specific journeys and stepping into the unknown.
That's a great point. I mean, if you look at many cultures, there's always something, for every single culture, there's a rite of passage, where we have gone from, the child, and then all of a sudden we become initiated into adulthood. That's something similar too. I'm not sure if that's the same thing, though, what the hero's journey is. But there are markers that most societies will have. Going back to your point, though, you reminded me of the transformational power of suffering.
Yes.
In terms of suffering, what Joseph Campbell and many people, and I think that and many religious folks and spiritual leaders about the power of suffering. And so suffering, some would say life is suffering. I think the Buddha even said that in many ways. And but there is a lot of power to it because it can transform. You can learn. It can be a transformative type of event for you, or for all of us. It can lead to personal growth. Nelson Mandela. There's many people who have been heavily suffering. In many ways,
Yeah.
like Nelson Mandela, who later then became the president of South Africa.
Right.
And then there's also Abdul Baha, and of course, like there's Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who submitted themselves, I think, in many ways to the suffering, but they've transformed, and through their own suffering, they became better and were able to have greater insight.
Right. And I think to take your point even further, a lot of times what is happening is we are letting go of the smaller or ego based self and sacrificing and growing into something more expansive that serves the collective in a bigger way. And so that's just a transformation that has so much purpose. I had this thought as we were preparing for this episode today, Rishi, that with everything that's happening in the world right now, and there's just a lot of unrest, there's just a lot of anxiety, and a lot of people with differing opinions fighting. What I'm seeing, and I think this applies today, is maybe humanity is facing the need to go on a collective hero's journey. And what we're seeing is just the resistance to that, because growth and suffering, as you pointed out, is necessary and it's uncomfortable. And a lot of people don't know how to handle it. And, in the last several months, I've kind of done my own little personal research to try and understand like the conservative movement a little bit. I would probably venture to say Rishi and I are pretty liberal leaning in our politics.
That'd be safe to say.
That would be safe. And I think at the root of it, there's a certain comfort that comes with the conservative mindset of just like, if you find that you fit within the hierarchy even a little bit, it can feel safe to just keep things as they are. But that doesn't mean that it's working really for you or for most people. But there are people who are genetically sort of inclined to really be uncomfortable with change. And what's the price tag we pay of not going on that hero's journey?
Well, I mean, you have stagnation. You have a lot of stagnation in life. You have a lot of stagnation in society. You have a lot of stagnation in your own life and unfulfillment. If you don't move past, you'll still stay. Part of what it is too is we all get in ruts. And so the idea I like to use is people who just do the same thing. You go to work, on a daily basis. You knock out your mortgage payment or your rent. You get your car payment done. And you go through this loop on a daily basis. And all of a sudden, that loop can turn into months. The loop can turn into years. And it happens all the time for people.
All the time. And
then eventually you get to this point where, it's not fulfilling for you. But then people would rather stay in a rut. And we at ClearMind, which is my company that I had, that we deal with PTSD and depression and anxiety, especially people want to stay. They would rather stay in a uncomfortable or unhappy rut rather than get out and venture into something new. Because it's difficult. It is difficult. That, in many ways, would be a call to adventure. When you feel that, so there's not a literal call. There's not going to be just. It's not this whole Star Wars thing. All those are just metaphors, right?
Yeah.
And we have these calls to adventure in our own life, and that would be where you have like a insight, maybe, or a dream perhaps, or maybe just this thought that's popped in your head. Like, why don't I just go start that business? Or why don't I just go back to school? I've talked to many people and they're always talking about, they're very bright people. These are good people, and I suggest, why don't you go back to school? Why don't you go back, get your master's or bachelor's, or go take some classes, something. And they all, sometimes, I mean, not all of them, but, it's just, once they reach a certain age, almost like they're comfortable and just comfortably numb, this comfortable rut. And they're like, well, I'm just too old. You know,
And that's just a story. That's just a thought that we tell
I
ourselves.
just, you've heard that before, right? I'm just too
Oh,
old.
completely. And, it's funny. I've heard this quote before. You argue for your limitations and they are yours. So there you go. But yeah, the richness of what can be gained by going on this journey. And I think this is the intersection of where I find art is very helpful, where art inspires us to think outside the box, and also where mentors are really powerful. So, Rishi, you have a lot of education. What are your degrees in?
So I have a Juris Doctorate and a medical doctorate.
Okay. So he's a lawyer and a doctor. He's really smart, folks. And you have your own business. You're someone who has taken the road less traveled.
Yeah.
Highly educated. Being an entrepreneur is taking risk. And, you're someone who's gone through and is on the other side of it and doing well. And so, that's a powerful thing. And so, maybe in that respect, for those of us who have gone on those hero journeys over and over, we have maybe a gift that we can give, or maybe even a responsibility to, share and nurture people along the way, because it is a lot.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. You'll go through. So part of the hero's journey is where you go once you cross that threshold, but then you're going to be tested a lot. And this is like where the growth comes from. It's only by through challenge can you then grow. You can't, if you never were challenged in life or never had any type of pain or this goal to kind of get over this hump, how are you going to get stronger?
Yeah.
You won't, because you need that particular stimulus in order to reshape how you think and to get past, to have that, to get your resilience up, for these difficult times. We have some, clients, in the program who I look at, they're maybe 65 or 70, and I don't know if they've ever been challenged in their life. I think some of these folks who I've met, they've been given a lot. How blessed, would that be to be given, a large inheritance, and to have like this home that you were given, or this whole, even a job or this business that you were given. And I meet some of these folks who are now kind of in their, middle-aged years or the later years. And then now they're realizing this, things are just not the same, and for them, maybe that their financial resources are different, or maybe their relationships are different. And now they're going through a complete crisis, and they don't know how to handle it because they've never been challenged. There's a very famous example about this place called, I think it's called New Earth, or Earth 2. It was that one experiment where they built that dome.
Oh, right.
What is it called again?
I don't remember.
I can't remember it either.
We'll put it in the notes at the bottom, right, if we remember.
So it was an experiment in the 80s where they built this big dome. Yeah. And it was supposed to be cut off from the whole world. They had plants in there, and then they were supposed to grow their own food.
So self-sufficient.
It was all totally self-sufficient. It was supposed to be some sort of way to see if we could survive on Mars or a different planet. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, it worked for the time that it was working. Mm-hmm. But something weird happened in that place.
Was it the people?
It wasn't the people.
Oh, okay.
The people were fine.
Okay.
They're all very, very fine. It was the trees. Oh. So they started falling down. They didn't know why. They were falling. All of a sudden, like this large, seemingly beautiful, healthy tree, because it's a very large biome thing that they built, and these trees were falling over. And guess what the reason was here? There's no wind.
So the wind made the trees stronger, and their roots were more firmly in the ground.
So all these trees outside, they're in the elements. They're forced to become strong.
That's genius.
Because they're being pushed on, right?
It's the tension.
Right, and the roots have to get deeper and stronger and more spread apart. But the roots in that biome, the one I was describing, there's no wind. And so they're standing there, and then any little thing, someone would just fall over because the roots weren't very strong.
Wow.
That's the power of challenge, and that's the power of suffering,
So maybe what people really need to be learning these days is having mental models like the hero's journey, and how to navigate the space of suffering because I think that we forget that everything in life is temporary. So one of my favorite books I ever read when I was 17 was The Road Less Traveled, and it was written by a psychologist named M. Scott Peck. And, it is so up there in how many copies it sold. It's almost sold as many copies as the Bible in some places. And it was this very sort of wise book. And one of the first sentences that it says in the opening is, life is difficult. Once you can accept this, you can transcend this. And he goes on to say in that first chapter that sometimes people will put off like a difficult conversation or some difficult circumstance they have to confront for months, years, decades, and prolong their suffering so much, versus if they just held the space for 5, 10, 30 seconds, they could get through the discomfort and transcend the difficulty of life. And so that book has been so monumental in me confronting like the difficult things in life. And I think it would be a wonderful thing to just teach everybody starting at a young age, because these are the skills that really make a difference in people's lives, because this is a shared human experience. We all go through hardship. We all have to have discomfort and grow.
100%. I mean, life is to be challenged and to grow. And that's part of what Joseph Campbell, talked about, and what in the myths that we have, they're the archetypes of the people, that, and if you look at the heroes and look at the stories, in common that we have, look at the Odyssey and look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, and look at, in our modern myths, our movies in many ways are modern myths as well.
Marvel, whatever.
Right. So part of what Joseph talked about was how these stories gave us a framework in which to then model our own lives on, right? And then part of what he also is saying now is that because of how old, we have these myths, right? And for the most part in Western civilization, the biggest myths that we have is through the biblical myths, right?
Yeah.
And I think they're wonderful. I mean, I think they're stories that were applicable and very, very apt for the people that they were made for at that time. However, what Joseph described was that those myths have become outdated, right? And then because when you have outdated myths, or even like I think that if you go to church, you hear these myths, you hear these stories during the sermon. But if you're not connecting with it, then it's not going to go deep inside of you. You're not going to go back and think about how Abraham, what did he do, or what did this person do? Some people might, but most people will not, And if you look at what's happening in modern society, this is what his connection was. When you have a decrease in these myths that are not applicable, then you remove that, and then what do people have frameworks to work with? There's not any, right?
It's difficult. And in fact, a lot of people, especially in the US, are moving away from organized religion because so many of us have been burnt or traumatized. And look how much history there is of abuse within, Christian churches. I think people are hungry for it. They want to separate themselves from, the kind of history of a lot of these institutions. And yet they're not sure where to go to get their nourishment.
They're not. And that's the thing. So then you have a lot, especially young people. The young people were the ones who could most benefit from strong myths, and so, because if as a young man, you're full of vigor, and vinegar, right? And you just want to get at the world, and you have all this energy, this pent up energy, and you want to do something with it, but you have no archetype. And you have maybe your parents don't teach you, school isn't teaching you these archetypes, because that's the power of myth. That is what the myths give us, is this type of way to be. How can we model ourselves, and then you model yourself with your people that
Yeah.
Maybe you watch TV, but there's not really anything. There's not a commonality. Like, what is giving us good archetypes in today's modern age? You tell me. Is there anything?
Oof. It's tough. I think we tend
that everyone can be
right.
It used to be maybe the president. Maybe
it used to be.
It used to be maybe I don't know, like astronauts maybe are heroes. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to think. I'm just I haven't really thought about it like this, but who are the people that we used to aspire to? Musicians, a lot of times.
Yeah,
Like,
First Lady. Right now, I think we tend to put a lot of emphasis on influencers and pop stars.
right, which is terrible.
Awful because
They're not. Why would you like model yourself? And that's maybe if you look at, in many ways, part of what's happening for people, the increase in depression, the increase in anxiety, and then of course, how are people going to find the right information for themselves to bring themselves out? How are they modeling their lives?
And that's where I think a lot of these authors and philosophers from the last 150 years really are so powerful. And we're talking a lot today about archetypes. And so that was really a specialized area of study for Carl Jung, who was he German or Austrian?
He was Austrian, yeah.
Yes. And, these archetypes are common again to a lot of cultures. So one instance might be the warrior. You talked about young men looking for a way to, like, a container for what they're feeling and all their passion and their vigor and whatnot. So the warrior might be such an archetype, right? The one who brandishes the shield, the one who kind of is symbolic ultimately of a hero who's going into battle and using strength and hopefully some reasoning and courage in a healthy way to, to take up space in the world. And we all sort of inhabit these archetypes at different times in our lives. So, another one might be the magician or the seeker or, the mother or the innocent. And so at different times in our lives, we sort of are in these spaces. And I think Carl Jung really did an excellent job about discussing that. But that's another topic for another time.
That is another topic. Yeah, that's a whole thing. I love Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the archetypes and those types of myths, that's what the importance of it. They give us something to hang our hats on. To how do we? Maybe that's part of the reason why Star Wars was such a big hit in many ways, is because we didn't have any modern myths. We didn't have anything. And so that really struck a chord back in 1978 or 76, whenever the first one came out.
So powerful.
It was very, very powerful, because then you have like this kid who's, represents our own subconscious. And then, we can always be, go to the, the dark, like the dark side, the other one,
the dark night of the soul, or
the light side of the force.
Oh, right. Yeah. All of that.
So we can always go for that, and that's something that those particular stories gave us.
And why don't we delve into that for just a little bit, Rishi? There's so much rich symbolism in that story. For instance, we have Yoda, and Yoda is it is this sort of figure. And how would you describe?
Well, he's definitely the mentor, right?
Yeah.
He's a mentor that we have. So there's two mentors. So Joseph Campbell again describes the importance of mentorship, and usually that happens, at the beginning of the hero's journey, but it can happen any time. So that the points that Joseph talked about, just by the way, they didn't necessarily have to go in that specific order.
Right, that makes sense.
There could be other things that happen. So those are mainly the big points, and usually it happens this way in the story, but there's never like a definite set point. So you can meet multiple mentors.
Sure.
So Luke met Obi-Wan Kenobi, who brought him past the threshold, past his comfort point. And then you have Yoda, another mentor who taught him. He was kind of finally a little bit transforming, but he needed more. He didn't know what he was going to do, so that's what Yoda was.
Yeah, and then Han Solo was sort of his colleague who helped him along the journey. Yeah. Additionally, I think there's a lot of symbolism in Darth Vader, and to me, it's a conflict between maybe government, the state, or the social conditioning is what Darth Vader represented, versus Luke in a lot of ways was the humanity of it all. And when Luke as a human, had to confront like the sort of machine of society and the societal expectations, and he took off the mask from his father, it was interesting. He saw this sort of shriveled up, unfulfilled, unexplored human. He confronted someone who had never gone on the hero's journey. So there was just a lot of
That's
rich
right.
symbolism.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's part of what our own type of struggles are. Maybe that's why it's so powerful, because you have, so yeah, so maybe Darth Vader is this concept of becoming part of the machine. You know, our humanity is stripped. If you look at
Mm.
Darth Vader, his humanity literally, I mean, all he was now a torso. You know, his
Yeah.
arms and legs were cut off, and he's literally put into like a robot machine to save his life. You know, that's very symbolic. You know,
Yeah.
whether George Lucas made it that way or not,
Mhm.
but that's what it really kind of represented. You know, in our struggle in today's modern society, you know, the problem with where we are in society is that we can be plugged in. You know, we
Mhm.
become these little cogs in this wheel to spin, become part of this big machine. You know, either the company that you're with,
Mhm.
either the hospital system that you're working, because we both work in healthcare, and, you know,
Guilty.
or if it's you're working for whatever it is, you know. So we all go through this feeling of having our humanity, our own dreams. Part of what that is our dreams will be stripped. How much are we willing to give up our own dreams? You mean, in order to become part of this machine? You know, there's always this force. The machine's big. It is the big machine, you know,
Yeah.
and there's lots of forces driving, you know, us into this machine to
Yeah.
become part of, to feed. The only purpose of the machine is to feed the machine.
It's just keep sustaining the machine.
There's no humanity to it at all,
No.
right? And so maybe that's what the whole idea of Darth Vader was. You know, this machine become part of the Empire, become, you know, join the dark side of the Force.
Mm.
You know, and then versus, you know, you have like this, you know, Luke Skywalker guy, you know, who's fighting for his own, and he did find that he was actually at a point where he met, you know, the question where he met his father. You know, he knows who he is, and he was asked to join the dark side of the Force. So that's very symbolic.
Yeah.
And we all get to that point too, as well.
Yeah. At some point.
You know, I know, like, for me personally, there is many points where, you know, when I was working in LA in 05, you know, and I got my bar license, and I was deeply unhappy at that time, you know, but I was living in Santa Monica. If you're not from LA, Santa Monica is a nice place to live. Kind of. I mean, it's a place people want to live near the beach.
It's very nice.
And then I was living in Santa Monica. I was driving this little sports car. I was working at this downtown law firm, and but yet somehow I was deeply unhappy.
So you checked all the boxes.
I did.
But there was a disconnect with your heart.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that's probably what is represented by Luke in the Star Wars is
Sure.
connection to the heart. And Darth Vader was completely cut off from his heart.
I could have kept on going. You know, I think maybe.
And you'd be rewarded for it in the system.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I would have been given a raise, you know, incremental raises over years. Maybe I would have upgraded to, you know, whatever apartment it was. And I don't know, but I was still so unhappy. So I had to make that choice at one point, you know, and we all maybe have that choice to make. Or maybe you're not even conscious of that.
Yeah, maybe it's just all drive. But I mean, can you talk about that process for you a little bit, Rishi? Like, what was it like to step into, or what you said, past that threshold? And did you have mentors and things to help you?
I did, yeah. So I did. You know, if it wasn't for them, you know, would I have been able to do it? You know, my father, actually, he was the one who encouraged me to go in. So he was not only my father, but he's also my mentor in that case, and he heavily encouraged me to go. And he says, like, don't worry about it. Age is just a number, and I'll never forget that. And then part of what Joseph Campbell says is that there's a very famous quote, which he said in a interview with Bill Moyers back in 1986 in this series called The Power of Myth. And you know it. You guys know it. It's Follow Your Bliss. You've heard it before.
Love that.
Yeah, so that's from Joseph Campbell. You know, and Joseph Campbell, what he meant, he further elaborated, which is, if you follow your bliss, then you will have doors open that you weren't even aware that they were there. And there's going to be helping hands. This is another thing that he said. There'll be helping hands that'll help you get to where you want to get to, you know, and it's because, like, you're in this zone of following what is in your heart. And for me, that happened. in many ways. There was like a lot of things that happened as soon as I made that decision. I could be a lucky one, I don't know, but I know for me, when I made that decision, all of a sudden it was like a weight lifted off of me, and
Yeah.
I had this mission to go on, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew how to do it, and it wasn't going to be easy. How was I going to get in? Number one, just because you make a decision, you're not going to get in medical school like, oh, just walk on in, sign me up in a little bulletin board, right?
But you made the first step, and I think that's really profound. Is what you're saying is that the people arrived and the circumstances arrived, and so I think from an energetic standpoint, when we move our attention and put our attention towards something,
That's right.
The universe connects with that on almost a frequency level, and so the pathway, we just have to make the steps. And sometimes it feels like, am I going to be blindfolded and step and not hit solid ground? That's the test, right? That's getting past the threshold. And then you make that first step and you realize there's still solid ground, even if I can't see it, and that it's worth it to keep going. But mentorship helps a lot. And so I find that everything in life is circular. So in the places where people have been a mentor to me and helped to support me through certain circumstances, I always find it's my job to return the favor at some point.
I mean, like, I feel the same, so I have like young interns in my program as well, who are staff members, and I always try to make sure I give them mentorship, either through good supervision, positive type of affirmations I give them, or give them, some sort of guidance when they need it. And I'm always available as well, because people are like that for me.
Yeah, and it's so essential. Good. Any other little thoughts we could share
about Joseph Campbell?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, there's just so much more. But, I think maybe, overall, for me, what Joseph Campbell represents, the reason why I like him so much, is because part of when I first discovered him a few years ago, it's been going on several years now. When I first heard him in The Power of Myth, and I knew who he was, because I think that Pacifica has a Joseph Campbell library. And that's when I first heard Joseph Campbell specifically, when I went to go do a lecture up there, 2013, I think, 2014, for compliance issues in healthcare. And then I stumbled upon The Power of Myth, and I just wasn't really thinking about it, and I listened to it. What Joseph Campbell gave me was more of a deeper understanding of why different civilizations are the way they are. One of the things that stands out for me in terms of Joseph Campbell is this thing that he said, which is, change the myth, you change the civilization.
Wow. Isn't that something?
Absolutely.
It's all the narrative. And so what's powerful to me is, again, there are certain things in the human experience that we just don't have words to describe. And so that's why things like myth and story and archetype can be so powerful to kind of guide us through those sort of invisible forces, where we can't control and we can't predict. But just knowing that other people have gone through it as well and gotten to the other side, and there's maybe everything we ever wanted there. So
our myths are the externalization of our subconscious. Because we think in metaphor, we think in stories. And if you ever study for any big test, that making an analogy or making some sort of story based, with the information that you want, makes it a lot easier to remember when you go back to the actual story itself, and you get the knowledge out of that. And so our myths also explain the differences between, the Oriental world or Eastern world versus the Western world. If you look at the base myths of Western civilization, that's something that Joseph Campbell also informed me about, which is those base myths, and it changed society for thousands of years. And maybe we're changing again now, but definitely those particular early stories definitely guided those civilizations for many, many years.
Yeah, you brought up a great point before we got on our call here about just the impact of sort of the Abrahamic religions and the foundation that sort of Western Occidental philosophy had, and how it has impacted really the world right now.
That's right.
What were some of those points that you brought out?
So in terms of the Eastern mindset. You know, if you look at India or China, which are the big civilizations in the Orient. So what is out there? And you can see those civilizations are very connected to farming, right? So if you look at the base civilization where it came up, you have the rivers out there, and you have a lot of rice cultivation. You have a lot of crop cultivation. You have a lot of cyclical stuff that's happening in nature, you know, with the monsoons and the rains and planting season and harvesting season, right? So then you become very kind of connected. So the society and the civilization becomes very connected to the cycles of the world, of
and
the
nature.
earth. Yeah, you have to. Otherwise, you'll miss your planting season. You'll starve. You know, your people you know, will have a hard time. You know, and there's flooding that happens from these things, right? Or flooding from like the rivers. So you have to predict that. That's like the how the Nile was as well. Like ancient Egypt, you know, the Nile flooded, you know, at very, very specific times. They're very connected with nature. And then, so that's one mindset. So you have like a very connectedness towards nature. And so when you're very connected with nature, all of a sudden your myths then become very connected also, will represent nature.
Yeah.
You know? And then if nature is feeding you, right, and nature is also growing things, and those particular crops that you're growing will also become, you know, maybe godlike. You know, what's giving you. So then all of a sudden you're seeing God in the crops that are coming off the ground. You're seeing God or whatever it is coming from the sky in terms of like the rainfall.
The rivers, the Ganga River in
That's
India
right.
is considered a goddess.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you look at the mountains as well, and you can see that they're very, very holy as well. And so they would even consider like those, like the Himalayas and Everest, and those are even godheads themselves, right? So then all of a sudden everything is God, and your myths are going to reflect that as well. And if you look at the Western civilization, look at the myths that became the guiding myths, right? Which are the Abrahamic ones that came out of the Middle East, you know, in the area in Iraq and Israel area and all those like in the desert areas. And so what type of life do people have out there at that time? You know, it's very kind of dry,
nomadic, tribal, all those things.
Warring type of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, you have to fight for everything you have. You know, water is scarce. There's a lot of scarcity mentality as well. You never know when the next famine's going to be. You know, there's a lack of water. You know, someone might attack you in the middle of the night. Your goats might die. Your herds might die. You're moving around. So all of a sudden you have a very harsh, that nature isn't a giving type of thing.
Yeah.
It's a very harsh environment to be fought, to be frightened with. And then all of a sudden your myths that are produced from that reflect that fear and reflect that scarcity and that anger in many ways.
Right, because the Old Testament God was a pretty vengeful God in a lot of ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Reflecting the society that it came from. But then that particular myth then became the guiding myth of Western civilization. So if you look at I can't blame everything on that. You know, it's possible to do it, but if your mind is a warring mind, you know, then it allows you to do a lot of warring things. If your myths, you know, and like your archetypes are you know, this vengeful, smiting God, who's ready to cut children in half, you know, and to turn people into salt and to destroy whole cities because you don't like the way they look or they think or something, then allows you, because obviously that didn't happen. Those are just myths and stories. But then you can then have the strength within yourself and then make these atrocities to be unkind to people.
Yeah, it's sort of outward projection of what you're taking in. And one interesting thing to me is the symbol of like Christianity is Jesus crucified on the cross, and people see and celebrate the bloody sacrifice of it all. But if you truly look at the message of Christianity, it's not the crucifixion, it's the resurrection. And that truly encompasses what the hero's journey is all about, is Jesus went in this sort of decisive action path and chose to embark on this really awful journey and, you know, transcended death itself.
So all that, you know, so Joseph Campbell did talk about that. So he said that Jesus is all of us, and then so Jesus submitted himself to suffering, right? Which is something transformative, and we all have to submit ourselves eventually to the cross. If we want to change, it is the carrying, always are the symbols, and so by carrying the cross, that is suffering, and then getting onto the cross. But then part of what's happening when you're nailed on the cross and really going through it, you're forced to transform, which he did, right? He went and then was transformed from man into God.
The divinity of it all. It's just so poetic.
And all of us can be that way. So it's all just symbolic, right? So it's this way that you interpret that particular one. These are all subconscious. Like Joseph Campbell, another big thing he taught me was that all these symbols in the myths that we have are just subconscious in us, and that we should take it that way. They're not literal.
So Rishi just fed into like the perfect note, because that is going to be our next episode, is about the subconscious mind, how it works and how it has the potential to change our lives if used to our advantage. So we are about at time, but I don't know. I feel like this has been a really awesome episode.
Yeah, I could talk about Joseph Campbell all day.
So maybe we'll need to have a part 2. But in closing, call to action: if there's any topics that you feel you would love for us to delve a little bit more into, just drop us a line. And also, we are, as you know, on Spotify, on Amazon Music. We have a YouTube channel, and we are on Apple Podcasts. If you want to do us a favor and you're getting some value out of the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. It makes a big difference for the algorithm. We'd really appreciate it. And I think that is our message for how to stay conscious for today.
I agree. You guys have a wonderful day, and get out there and heed that call to adventure. You just don't be afraid. Just go for it.
Just jump right in.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Thanks for now.